The file begins. The silence that followed the federal raids was heavier than the gold chains he once wore. His empire, built on beats and bravado, was now a crime scene. The air in his palatial homes, once thick with the smell of success and Ciroc, now smelled only of government ink and stale fear. Pause. This was the anatomy of a fall. His invincibility, his most carefully produced asset, shattered like a champagne flute dropped on concrete. For decades, Sean Combs sold the world a fantasy, a kingdom built from nothing. Now the walls of that kingdom were being torn down, brick by digital brick, and the world was discovering what was hidden in the foundation. This was no longer a party. Pause. It was a posthumous audit of a legacy that was still breathing. The first lawsuit was a stone thrown at a fortress, but the walls were already weak. The accusations of early 2026 were not stones. They were a flood, an inventory of sins, typed in 12-point font and filed with the court. Each document, a ghost from a past he thought he had outrun or bought. The public, which had danced to his rhythms for a generation, now read the sheet music of his alleged crimes. The media frenzy was a meat grinder. It took the shiny, curated image of Diddy and rendered it into something unrecognizable, something grotesque. He had spent a lifetime controlling the narrative. Now, the narrative was controlling him. And from inside a federal holding cell, whispers began to circulate. Whispers of a confession far more damning than anything written on legal paper. But before the whispers, there was a roar. The sound of a young man from Harlem who understood that poverty's greatest crime is anonymity. His ambition was not just to escape the concrete maze, it was to own it. The internship at Uptown Records was the first move on the board, a calculated infiltration. He learned the architecture of a hit, the chemistry of a star. He saw the machine from the inside. Pause. And he knew he could build a better one. Bad Boy Records was not a dream. It was a hostile takeover of the airwaves, wrapped in shiny suits and drenched in champagne. The music was the weapon, but the true product was the persona, the charismatic hustler who could sell you the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Each platinum plaque was a brick in the wall against his past. Each hit single, a layer of concrete poured over the fear of returning to nothing. It was the forging of a legacy, a monument built to eclipse a shadow. The only question was what he was burying beneath it. The music was just the key, a skeleton key that unlocked the kingdom. Once inside, the records became secondary, a means to an end. The real game was empire. The anatomy of his ascent was a masterclass in diversification. Sean John was not a clothing line. It was a uniform for the newly minted. Ciroc was not a vodka. It was the liquid form of aspiration. He wasn't selling products. He was selling a piece of himself, a sliver of the myth. Every party was a shareholder meeting. Every photograph, a press release. The man became a brand, and the brand became a fortress of untouchable success. He had built an ecosystem where his gravity was the only law. This was the peak. The point where a man who has outrun all his rivals begins to believe he can outrun consequences themselves. It is the most dangerous form of solitude. Pause. The belief that you are the only one in the room, even when it's full of people. But the people in the room had begun to talk. The first voice to break the silence was Pause Cassandra Ventura. The lawsuit was not a negotiation, it was a detonation. A 20-year partnership summarized in 30 pages of cold legal prose that read like an inventory of sins. The allegations were a blueprint of control, a detailed account of a mangled fate. The fortress walls, once thought impenetrable, showed their first hairline crack. The rapid settlement that followed wasn't a quiet end. It was an admission and a signal flare. Soon, the single voice became a chorus. Accusations followed accusations, each one a hammer blow against the carefully constructed myth of the untouchable king. The brand built on aspiration was now being redefined by allegations of exploitation. The public image, polished to a mirror shine, began to tarnish. This was no longer about business, it was a reckoning. The reckoning had its own bureaucracy, a ruthless machine of clerks, investigators, and prosecutors who do not care for celebrity. They began the slow, methodical process of a posthumous audit on a living man. Secrets that were once currency inside the empire became exhibits. Whispers became sworn testimony. The fortress was breached, and its contents were being tagged for evidence. They unearthed documents. They dissected timelines. They found the tapes. Pause. The silent, grainy footage of an assault in a hotel hallway did more damage than any rival album. It was visual confirmation. The abstract horror became a concrete reality. Legal filings from producers like Rodney Jones were another front. Even when courts dismissed some charges, others stuck. Like a persistent infection, the system was designed to grind. It stripped away the glamour, the entourage, the power, until all that was left was a man in a room, answering questions he had spent a lifetime avoiding. His legacy was no longer his to write. It was now a case file. And what a case file it was. Not just a collection of charges, but an inventory of sins. A detailed anatomy of control. The court transcripts read like a user manual for a tyrant, outlining the mechanics of his private kingdom. There were rules for guests. There were protocols for staff. There were non-disclosure agreements that were less legal documents and more oaths of fealty to a Sun King who believed the light never set on his desires. The fatal flaw wasn't greed. It was the unshakable conviction of his own divine right. Pause. The belief that consent was a commodity he could purchase, package, and trade at will. Prosecutors laid out a pattern, a ritual. The parties were not celebrations. They were loyalty tests. Intimacy was not a connection. It was a transaction recorded for leverage. This is how the untouchable operates. He builds a world so complete, so hermetically sealed, that the laws of our reality no longer apply within its walls until the walls are breached, and the language of his world is translated for a jury. Pause. That language spoke of coercion, of fear, and of a profound, chilling loneliness at the heart of the spectacle. The moral verdict preceded the legal one, and the financial sentence was carried out instantly. The empire, once a monument to black capitalism, revealed itself to be a house of cards in a hurricane. The name Combs became radioactive. Ciroc, the spirit that fueled a decade of parties, was now poison on the shelf. Television networks that built specials around his genius now planned documentaries on his downfall. Former allies, men who grew rich in his shadow, now issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves, their lawyers scrubbing his name from their corporate histories. It was a digital exorcism. Pause. A systematic erasure. The calls for boycotts were deafening, but the silence from boardrooms was louder. Every closed deal, every canceled partnership was a brick pulled from the fortress. His legacy was no longer a catalog of hits, but a list of liabilities. The price of the brand had been his soul. Pause. The market was simply correcting the valuation. The valuation was settled in a room without windows. The man who owned time was now serving it. 4 years and 2 months. A small number for a lifetime of excess. A lifetime of debt. Pause. Inmate number 78513-054. That was his new brand, his new title. The founder of Bad Boy Entertainment became a chaplain's assistant, trading sermons on success for whispers of scripture in a federal facility designed for addiction. The final, cruelest joke. While his lawyers fought the ghosts of new accusations, of Tupac and old sins, his reality shrank to the size of a cot. From orchestrating global parties to scrubbing floors. The silence in his cell was louder than any beat he ever produced. It was the sound of a legacy turning to ash. Pause. The sound of absolute zero. So this is the inheritance, not the platinum plaques or the stock portfolio. The real legacy is the blueprint for self-destruction. A cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and green rooms for a generation. He was Icarus with a record deal. For decades, the industry mistook his impunity for genius. He wasn't a king. Pause. He was a contagion. The final verdict wasn't written on a court document. It was etched onto a grainy surveillance video, a permanent digital scar. His story, once a self-produced epic of triumph, is now being told by others, by his victims, by his rivals. His name is no longer an asset. Pause. It is a liability. A warning label on the intoxicating bottle of fame. The empire is gone. The music will fade. All that remains is the anatomy of the fall.